For the Hansard record, if you could please state your name and the capacity in which you appear, and we'll start with you, Mr Dancy.
Eric Dancy, Executive Officer, Queensland Dairy Farmers Organisation.
Thank you. Mr Tessman, you're out there.
Yes, I'm Brian Tessman and I'm the President of the Queensland Dairy Farmers Organisation.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to offer the opportunity for either one or both of you to make an opening statement before we go to questions. Mr Dancy, I'm looking at you. Do you have an opening statement?
I'll leave it to Mr Tessman to give that.
Oh, now I got that one wrong. There you go.
Yeah,
I had one chance of getting it right and or wrong, and I got the other one. Mr Tessman, sorry.
Thank you, and thank you, Senators, for the opportunity to speak here today. I think, as you're probably aware, there is a number of problems in the dairy industry around the country, and particularly in Queensland, and those issues are both in the market and in the structure of the dairy industry as well, and that's certainly reflected strongly in Queensland and the issues and the problems in Queensland and the issues and the way things have developed since the industry was deregulated. And I would say that back at the time of deregulation there were a lot of changes made to the industry that were done in a fair bit of haste, and organisations were put together and other organisations were created at both a regional and national level that possibly, even if they, I have some doubts whether they were quite the right thing for the industry at the time then, but I think they're certainly not the right structure and the right organisations to service the industry today. But clearly at the moment, I think the industry structure really is broken and not acting in the best interests of farmers, and that it goes right across. So there's issues in funding, into advocacy, and getting the bang for the buck there, and there's clearly issues in getting good delivery out of Dairy Australia. And so I think transformational change to this structure is really the only option to fix those issues. And in Queensland, we are looking at a service and advocacy company. The farmers in the whole dairy plan process clearly indicated that they wanted to move towards one company that could cover both the advocacy and the service sections of the industry, so by service, RD&E, and those other service type functions. And for that, they were also keen for Queensland to, amalgamate into New South Wales, because there are so many similarities in Queensland and New South Wales in the range of production systems. There's certainly a huge range across both states of production systems, ranging from a total mixed ration, which is probably more consistent, through the whole region. A TMR system is somewhat a TMR system, whether you're in the bottom of New South Wales or whether you're on the Darling Downs, but certainly many of the other systems vary to a fair extent around. There's various grazing systems and partial mixed rations which sit in between, but those systems are consistent across both states, and I would suggest probably also to a fair extent in Western Australia, but they are often quite different to the systems that are in Victoria, and for that matter I would say Tasmania. So we need one dairy company to cover all of these issues, in both advocacy and RD&E in Queensland and New South Wales. But the really critical thing, and I think the thing that's different to what maybe has been put forward in the joint transitional team process that has been in the dairy plan process so far, is I think that process needs to be completely accountable to farmers and answerable to farmers, and farmers need to be heard and feel that they're heard in that. And of course, critically in that, the leaders of that organisation needs to be democratically elected by farmers. After all, certainly on the in the Dairy Australia, the service side, all farmers pay the levy, so really all farmers should have vote and really have a link in there, and it shouldn't be those who are only directly involved in the processes of whether it be Dairy Australia or their sub-regional groups. But but I think there is a critical need to get that together, and for that to be the regional body that then links up into a national body for the whole nation. I think also milk pricing and the whole way the market works is also really in common across those two states, and that's clearly not working through the whole supply chain, through the whole value chain. Milk pricing isn't working, and that has led to all sorts of problems. Right through the most probably best known one, of course, is the $1 a litre milk issue, but there's problems all the way through the whole value chain, and I think the government needs to look at a range of measures, unless we go right back to a fully regulated system, which certainly has other issues with it. To make the market work and for us to live in this market, we need that market to really give farmers a fair go. But I think at this stage the industry is in such a position that we need a pricing mechanism such as a levy on retail milk. And I know working with our national bodies, they've looked into it, and we really can see no real impediments into a levy. Certainly a levy of somewhere, for instance, of 15 cents on the retail price of milk or in that area. I don't think it would breach any international trade or any other issues, and I think there already is legislation that could handle it. In there, I think that levy would provide funds to go back to farmers, not only in Queensland, but I think around the country. But certainly, from our point of view, to provide some funds to Queensland farmers on their farm gate price of milk to actually help them out of what has been a series of hammer blows on their businesses that have driven many of them out of business, and the ones that are there now are really walking wounded at the moment, and really need some funds to keep going. And to if we're going to have a dairy industry in future, we need to have something to help get through what is a continuing low point at the moment. Also, though, clearly we need a wholesale review and amendment of all agricultural competition policy, and it all sits in around that, and of course that flows through. There's issues in other agricultural commodities, not just dairy. We recognise that, but on from that, I think an agricultural commission to review and regulate agricultural competition policy, I think, is really important. I know the ACCC has moved in there and has made some movements more in some of those directions, but I think clearly we need a specific agricultural commission to regulate this. I think the ACCC in being set up is mainly focused on the consumer and the general culture in the organisation. While clearly there's been some good moves of recent times in there, I really think we need something more than that and something different to that. And we also support a Royal Commission into the retail sector and their dealings, and probably more than just dairy, but into their whole dealings with farmers and with processors. I think that's really needed to clear up on that end. That's an orphan for a lot of farmers. It's a step away. They deal with the processor, but the processors are very limited by what they can do in dealing with the retailer, and it's a really significant industry issue for the dairy industry, and I think for other industries as well. And I think really importantly, we need transparency in the whole milk value chain and supply chain, and getting information back to the consumer as to where their milk comes from, and what farmers get paid for that milk. How it all works, and QDO has certainly been moving on that and slowly working through issues with some help from the state government, but working through issues with the ACCC around our Fair Go dairy. And I think our Fair Go dairy is something that could have benefits for farmers in other regions and in other industries, but certainly the Fair Go dairy is something I think that's really badly needed in our dairy market, and I think consumers are looking for that when they want to buy a brand of milk that is actually being fair to farmers and paying a fair price and doing the right thing by farmers, and something that's actually, checked out that they can have confidence in, and that's what we hope to give them by a Fair Go Dairy logo, that they can easily see what they should purchase if they have those concerns, and to basically just give them that information. If they wish to buy a cheaper brand and they're not interested in farmers or not interested in other issues, well, they're still obviously completely free to do that. I think, though, with those, on top of all of those issues, a really important thing is the code of conduct, the mandatory code of conduct, and it is a good start. But we have certainly, in getting that into place over this current year, there are processes that are trying to get around that code. This is a code between farmers and milk processors, and some of those milk processors technically are retailers as well. It flows onto them, where the retailer is simply getting their milk toll processed by the processor. We've had issues around some processors who are only quoting in our region 50 cents a litre a minimum price for 2 to 5 years, and which is just completely unrealistic, and others who are quoting things like 58 cents without price, without disclosure of a provenance premium that would be in there. So some of those things are really not only, if they're not against the code, they're certainly against the intent of the code, and I think some of those things need to be changed. The status of long-term contracts is certainly an issue. For long-term contracts, as of the 1st of January, and there's questions around that, and the tightening of non-exclusive contract clauses. We certainly have processors that will offer a non-exclusive supply contract. That's so a farmer technically could supply some of their milk to another processor, which under most of the current contracts they're not allowed to do, certainly in our region. But the contract for the rest of that milk is at a price that's completely unrealistically low. So we realise that there would have to be provisions around non-exclusive supply contracts, around how much you supply each day, but we feel that should be on a volume basis, not on a percentage of farm supply basis. And you would think that would be the better outcome for a processor, to know roughly a volume rather than a percentage of what that farm will produce, because that could vary greatly. And we need that supply contract to be at a realistic price. And I think we need to remove the cooperative concessions clause in the code of conduct, because it seems to be panning out that I think is being used to get around the whole intent of the code. So I think there's some things that need to be changed. But clearly, all of those things need to change. I think it's really been unfair, and a lot of people have said it's unfair for farmers to be thrown into a market where they've got no ability to bargain. And I think, though, at the same time, on the service side, I think it's been really unfair for farmers in our region in Queensland, and I suspect some other states as well, to be told by people right up to Dairy Australia that they've got to get more efficient if they're going to survive, but not have very little specific spending on RD&E focused at the systems that we use in the subtropics and tropics and some of the drier regions and some of the hotter, more humid regions. And so that's really unfair as well. We need specific research, and we have had issues where QDO has had to step in to try and prompt some research in critical issues after years of arguing the fact right through to with Dairy Australia and other bodies, and getting really frustrated, and have had to step in and try and fill the gap in the market ourselves. So we need all of these things, senators, and a combination of them. But all of these things are really doable. And if we're going to, maintain a supply of milk and a local supply of milk around the country, and have milk left over in the southern states for export, I think we really need to address these issues. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Tessman. I'll just tell you, I'm joined by Senator Hanson, who brought the inquiry on and ushered it through the Senate with the support of all parties. Senator Susan McDonald, and I commend Senator McDonald because it's a big call to call for a Royal Commission, but that's her passion about this industry, and that's on display well and truly, and has been for many, 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 many months that she's been here. And Senator Matt Canavan, who used to be the Rock Minister. So there you go. So the Minister for Energy and Mining and all sorts of things like that. So that's... Mr Tessman, you talked about the Royal Commission, that's why I just want one thing, and I know that Minister Littleproud has not knocked back the call from Senator McDonald, but would want evidence of malpractice. Does the QDO agree with that comment, firstly? And secondly, do you have any evidence of malpractice?
Well, I understand that, that there would be, we would need some evidence of malpractice. Eric, could you add something into that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly been some interesting behaviours between retailers and processors over the last 10 years or so, and quite frankly, a lot of the processors are quite blunt in private conversations about that, but I'm not sure how willing they'd be to stick their hand up.
Yeah, and it's a big, I'm just trying to I'm trying to be straight up. What do you mean I'm trying to be? I'm always straight up front about this. I think it's a bit wish-washy to say that we need evidence of malpractice when we've gone from how many thousand dairy farmers to absolutely 5/8 of 9/10 of very little. And the poor devils are coming to every avenue they can for every politician to say that we're being squeezed, and this is not an unusual argument in this nation lately when there's some shocking practices that Senator McDonald has uncovered by I keep thinking lactose, what are they called? Lactalis. And then we get the smooth as cat poo representative from Woolworths. He thought he was pretty slick sitting in here in December trying to tell me about certain costs and how things are done. He got a very rude and abrupt end into his bull dust session. But all right, that's fine. I'm going to hand over to Senator McDonald.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr Tessman, Mr Danzi, great to have you here. Can we start with RD&E? So Dairy New South Wales is New South Wales's Research and Development Corporation. What is Queensland's Dairy Research and Development Corporation?
It's subtropical dairy. It's Queensland and some of northern New South Wales. That it covers just the northern region. The northern rivers. I think down towards Taree. Oh no, maybe not. But it's certainly the northern rivers section of New South Wales is in with Queensland in that, and it's called subtropical dairy.
So if I was to look at research and development and extension monies spent in subtropical dairy, would I be able to see significant breakthroughs and changes over the last 20 years, do you think?
I'm afraid not, Senator. I think the specific, subtropical region dairy breakthroughs in the last 20 or probably longer than that, but towards 30 years have been few. I think there's been little money spent really directly on the systems and the needs of those farmers. We've had programs delivered to us on things like mastitis and other things, but they've generally been things that are needed in southern Australia and not specifically needed for northern Australia. But it actually goes a little further than that too, in that often they have been delivered in a form that suits, say, Victoria or Tasmania, where there's farmers in regions that are close to each other, whereas particularly in Queensland, where we've still got a number of dairy farmers, but they're spread out over a wide area, and getting them together is more difficult. And so often the way they're delivered results in poor attendance at those functions. So even those things are not extended well there, and probably as a result of that, maybe uptake isn't as good. But the bigger problem than that is simply they're not addressing the issues in Queensland. And, you know, as I said, QDO had to jump in on issues and try and prompt something after years of negotiating with Dairy Australia on issues such as tropical grass and, you know, bovine Johne's disease and things like that, where we had differences. Had to jump in and really play in that market to get any sort of an outcome, if you can say we've achieved an outcome there at all at this stage anyway.
Thank you. So, Mr Danzy, could I ask you specifically, do you think you could, has there been any views put about quantifying what reduction in costs there might be for subtropical dairy farmers in Queensland and northern New South Wales if some of those investments had been made in subtropical grasses and some of the other things that Mr Tessman mentioned?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's probably realistic to assume that with investment in grasses or varieties, you know, at least 1% gain per year is realistic. So over a 20 or 30 year period, that's very significant. I would have thought 30-40% is very conservative, and unfortunately, without that investment, you know, our yields have remained the same, and certainly in the more temperate areas of Australia, you've probably seen yields increase by that 30, 40, 50%. And I think too, what concerns me, it's not just Queensland itself, it's anyone outside of that sort of typical temperate system. So, you know, the sort of varieties that we're speaking about with tropical grasses like kikuyu, well, they're grown throughout Queensland, they're grown throughout New South Wales, they're grown in northern Victoria, they're grown in Gippsland, they're grown in parts of South Australia and also very widely in Western Australia. So it's not like they're just for Queensland. They are for anyone who is out of that sort of typical cold climate, you know, Victorian, you know, Tasmanian sort of system.
So, I mean, that's a very significant number if you're talking, you know, up to 30%, because you know, that's some of the challenge that we have in the dairy industry in Australia is that Queensland and New South Wales and WA are often represented as being somehow inefficient because of higher costs. But what you're suggesting is that it's the lack of investment that has resulted in those the cost differentials.
Oh, correct. And I think Colin Thompson previously from New South Wales Farmers highlighted it. Now, Colin's obviously an absolute elite dairy farmer in Australia, which is why we got him up at the end of February to speak to a lot of our farmers. But the two critical bits with RD&E for Queensland and New South Wales, I would suggest, is firstly development of better varieties of critical pasture species, which hasn't happened for the last 20 or 30 years, except for a tokenistic attempt. And secondly, adoption of systems such as Colin's, the TMR systems, learning from the best in the US, getting the best farmers like Colin to adopt that here, and then using that as an extension model to get other farmers to do. Now, unfortunately, because of the complete breakdown of RD&E, certainly in Queensland, we've had to try and do that ourselves. So we're getting Colin up to Queensland, linking him up with some key farmers, getting them to adopt. So it's because there's such a massive void in the RD&E sector that organisations such as QDO have had to go into that space, despite the fact there's probably been $200 million or close to that much investment in RD&E in Queensland and New South Wales over the last 20 years through government levies and farmer levies. They've just gone into the wrong areas, and there's been little output for that or outcome, you know, despite the massive investment.
Okay. Thank you. That's really specific. I just want to move to contracts. And I think this idea of having non-exclusive contracts using volume, not percentage, is an important point to make, because if you're a grain grower or a beef producer, you know, you don't have to commit to a volume or, you know, you don't have to commit to your processor how much you're going to deliver each year. And I think it's extraordinary in the milk space that milk processors are trying to hold producers to that. What's your view on the non-exclusive contracts? Should there be some more flexibility in the contracts?
Well, Senator, if I could answer that, I certainly think there should be. It's been the practice certainly in the last 20 years, and to some extent before that. I think it grew out originally out of the fact that, you know, prior to deregulation, there was quite a number of processors that were cooperatives, so they felt that they deserved to get all the milk from all their farmers and take it, and that they had a control of it, and the ones that were not cooperative still had that same thought. But even as the cooperatives disappeared from the market since deregulation, that belief has always sort of seemed to stay there. So it's been very difficult for farmers to find other, to make the most of opportunities. And at times, some farmers have been told by processors that that some of their milk, and they've been in a two-tier price system, that some of their milk really isn't wanted. They were going to get a price that was nothing more than a token for picking it up, really. That was all they were going to be paid, but yet they couldn't supply anyone else, even though maybe just down the road there was this cheese factory, a more boutique type cheese factory that wanted the milk, and it was maybe, we know often they were struggling to get supply. So that has really not only hit the farmers directly in the short term, but when you had those other like cheese factories or whatever, other people needing the milk on a more niche market basis, when they can't get the milk, often they will go out of business, and I think that has happened, and so that of course reduces all the market options for the farmers as well going forward. So, but we also recognise that at the same time processors need some certainty, so they don't want to turn up and have 6,000 litres, one day, and 2 days later they've got 600 litres. But if there's a volume commitment with a small margin of variation in there, that should answer those quite well, and the farmer can plan out increases, supplying other farmers, whatever, as you'd expect normally any business would do, rather than be in a situation where they've got to give 90, well, in the past give all their milk, or even as currently is being looked at, 90% of their milk, whatever that is, specifically to one processor, because that's really controlling the farmer. It's not giving the processor certainty, if that is what they actually want, of a regular supply of milk, and it's also not giving the farmer the opportunity to go and develop another market out there for their milk that might be a far better market, and a market that might grow in the future.
Yeah, terrific. So it is about being able to access those premium markets, and that's the point of the non-exclusive contracts. I'll just ask you one more question, because I'm just conscious we're running out of time, and I want to give you the opportunity to answer some more questions from other senators. But I'm aware that in Queensland, Lactalis is amending their contract to have a clause that would mean that if they believe that a producer was doing media or being negative about the company, that Lactalis was reserving the right not to pick up their milk. And I'm absolutely horrified to hear that, because if dairy farmers weren't already in a terrifically unfair position and a powerless position, the threat of not picking up your milk, which has a very short shelf life and which there is almost no other options in southeast Queensland to get your milk processed at short notice anyway. I'm very concerned about that, and I just want to see if you've got a view on it, and if you're aware of other milk processors including the same clause in their contract.
I will throw that Eric on this as well in a minute, Senator. But I would also, I can add, my view is that is, sort of abhorrent. That's not something that should be in there. I know there probably has got to be some level of, suitable behaviour by a supplier, but a supplier surely should be, free to, raise issues in public that they have to be able to criticise their supplier if they feel they are being treated unfairly, and this is. But I would also add that in the past we have seen this done, and not Parmalat Lactalis, I would add, by others in here that have tried to do that, and we have had that issue before. So it's an ongoing issue, with processes. It's probably something that needs to be watched, and clearly I agree with you as Senator, that's not really a suitable thing to have in a place if we're going to have a marketplace with some freedom and some fairness in it. Eric, have you got anything to add in there?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any other contracts, Senator, which have got that specific clause in there. All contracts that I've read have got clauses around illegal behaviour and ability for processor to terminate contracts, which is fair and reasonable, but I'm not aware of any other behaviour clauses. I think I should just highlight too the issue that Brian's raised before around a processor having it was very clear with the code about the need to disclose legitimate commercial minimum prices in your contracts. And I think it's fair to say that the majority, all but one processor in Queensland, has looked at that, got legal advice, and the legal advice has been we can't have long-term contracts with ambiguous or non-existent minimum prices clauses. So we've seen all the major processors and all the minor processors, bar one, move to shorter contracts, typically 12 to 14 months, in line with what they believe they can offer legitimately as a schedule of prices. One processor, unfortunately, has chosen to push the envelope substantially, stick with their current system, offered a very reasonable first-year prices of in the order of 70 cents a litre, with a very detailed pricing schedule of monthly payments and bonuses and penalties and everything else, and chosen to have for year 2 to 5 a minimum price of 50 cents, which just doesn't make any sense at all. So it's really, quite frankly, aghast what they've done, and shocked many in the industry, certainly many other processors who have done the right thing of just asking what the hell's going on. And certainly it's a complaint that we've put through to the ACCC about the behaviour of that processor, that you either move to short contracts where you can offer legitimate commercial prices, or you offer long contracts with legitimate prices throughout the whole thing, not have this attempt to get around the clear intent and direction of the code with this sort of behaviour. So I expect, well, I know that ACCC is investigating as they should, and I hope they deem this behaviour to be inconsistent with the code. Because what we don't want to see is this get through, and then other processors who've done the right thing have clearly an incentive to copy this bad behaviour if it's deemed illegal. So it's really, that to be honest, is by far the biggest issue in the code for Queensland.
So I think, when the code came out, lots of people have wanted there to be a silver bullet to fix the dairy industry, and of course there isn't one. There's been a series of reasons why we've got to this point, but I'm really pleased the code was not seen as being very sexy. It's got a lot of technical issues in it, but that is a great result in that the transparency of price has shone a light on bad behaviour, and there's been a change of behaviour in those shorter contracts. So that's very pleasing to see some changed behaviour already. Thank you very much, Chair.
Can I just clarify? Thank you, Senator McDonald. So, sorry, I was just writing something down when you were starting that line of questioning there. So, have the ACCC corrected or taken action against that processor that did the first year at 70 cents and then the next 2 years at 50? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
It's only just been published. It was the 1st of June.
1st of June. We put in a complaint officially to the ACCC maybe 5 days ago, so they're obviously investigating a few days ago.
Oh, so they haven't fixed it yet? No.
I mean, it's going to be tough for the ACCC, but they should act pre the 1st of July, ideally.
Well, we can ask them when they get here. That's right. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm sure they're investigating right now.
Thank you. Senator Hanson.
Thank you very much, Chair. The mandatory code of practice was very important to the industry, which we got up and running, but it'll take about 12 months for it to actually really see the workings of it. Would you say that?
I think with the... Sorry, Brian, you go first.
Oh, you can, Eric. You go.
I think with the announcement, with the requirement of processors to list their contracts for the next financial year on 1st of June, that's really the first big step and test of the code. I think it's fair, as I said before, that a lot of the processors have amended their behaviour and complied with the direction of the code, and that's improved outcomes already, but some have not heeded that advice. I think it's going to be 2 steps. One is what happens now and how the ACCC responds to the identified bad behaviours, And then secondly, what learnings are there over the first 2 years to undertake the review next year, because there's supposed to be a new code in place for the 1st of January 2022. So it's about enforcement now, learn what the gaps and then challenges still are, and around tightening exclusivity and minimum price obligations, I think I'd probably tell them. And then we can see a much more effective code released on the 1st of January 2022.
My understanding is the Dairy Code does not fix the power imbalance between processors and the supermarkets, one of which New Zealand-based multinational Fonterra is seeking to exit the processing business in Australia. Are you aware of that? Have you got any comments to that?
Well, we haven't, but Senator, I'm not actually aware of that, but I think it's quite true. The code does not extend out to the retail, and doesn't cover the market situation between processors and retailers. We asked right from the beginning when we were looking, we were talking and lobbying for a code as part of the measures to help sort out the issues in the industry. We clearly asked for a code that would go all the way from the farm gate to the retail checkout. And it's disappointing that part that it hasn't covered that section of it. I don't think it fully covered the grocery food code of conduct covers that to a satisfactory extent at all at this stage. But, so yeah, there certainly still is an issue between processor and retailer, and that's something that needs to be
Looked at in the review.
Reviewed in the future,
Yep.
Absolutely, and that is our position, our policy position at QDO, is that's something that still needs to be looked at.
Right. In your submission to this committee, this hearing, you're very scathing of Dairy Australia. You said Dairy Australia is not effectively held by checks and balances by industry representative organisations, and as such does not support the best interests of the dairy industry, farmers or the government. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, yeah, our feeling in there is the setup of Dairy Australia is not really a democratic process as we would see one that should be in place, a process where farmers, directly elect people to the boards, certainly, or to the majority of the boards, whatever way you look at that. But that, I think, is a critical issue, and simply the farmers and the farmer organisations, I don't think, have enough control over what the Dairy Australia is delivering and how it's done. And clearly that comes back. It specifically, I suppose, is amplified in places like Queensland, where, as we've said, there's been a shortage of RD&E and services provided now for some time, and there's been clearly a focus more so on some of the more southern regions, and so it's certainly amplified. But the farmers certainly feel they do not get bang for the buck they put into Dairy Australia, but at the same time they don't feel that they're heard and their complaints aren't heard. So that is the problem. The role that Dairy Australia plays in the industry is a very important role. We need somebody, with RD&E and to provide services to the industry. Our complaint is, I think it can be done a lot better, and then probably in a better fashion, and it's quite doable. I think there clearly needs to be a restructure of how all that works, and that's what we've been talking about. We focused on Queensland and New South Wales, but clearly that goes up to the national view, and we need to change it to give a stronger voice to the farmers, not take that voice away.
Well, that's right. I mean, so the farmers pay the levy, which is nearly 3 cents on a litre of milk to levy, and plus it's higher than that on the products, on milk products. But you actually the farmers really don't have a direct say in anything to do with the board. I know there's two groups, there's Group A and there's Group B, which is represented, the Group B is represented by Farmers Association. They have got the Queensland Dairy Farmers Association. But you tell me, then how is the board, how's elected? Who appoints them?
What's the process? Yeah.
What's the process?
Senator, there is a selection committee which Dairy Australia organises, and from that selection committee they put a selected candidate for each position forward. There are some farmer, candidates that need to board directors that need to be farmers, but there's a significant number that don't. But those candidates are put forward, and
Are those candidates
simply go to the AGM, where they're either approved or not approved, and
farmers have no
usually they're
input.
approved. There is an option if somebody wants to, if they get enough signatures to trigger an election, and that has happened, but it's very rare.
Do the farmers have a say at all in who will be go on the board?
Well, only that if they've taken out actual Dairy Australia membership, they can go to the AGM and vote either to approve or not approve that selected person.
So the answer is very little, and that's why we're certainly favouring a democratic process for election, where all farmers get an equal say, not just those who are in the tent, which is the current system. Yep. The only people who go to Dairy Australia AGMs typically are those who are aligned to Dairy Australia through them personally or the regional development groups that sit underneath them. That's why we're strongly favouring a regional process where farmers in a region get to select who their representatives. They select the state representatives or the regional representatives, and they then select the national. That's the only way the democracy will actually work.
I just have
a couple of follow-ups quickly.
I just want to do something,
You go
and then
first,
I'll let you go, because Senator Hanson does have the call, but if it's on the same topic.
It's on the same,
And Mr Tasman, this model is not strange or unknown to this committee, and it was uncovered predominantly through the Red Meat inquiry that I chaired also, and MLA, right, their structure was exactly the same. It was the Red Wine Brigade, the clothes shop, the boys, the good old boys, and I find that absolutely abhorrent that people are paying levies, and these people are hard-working family businesses, and you don't get the democratic say on who is going to represent you. So this model has been broken at MLA, and I strongly suggest, Mr Danzy, that I'd be very happy, as the committee here, to follow up with you well, put it this way, I would suggest that you get the report from that inquiry, download it from the RAT committee, RAT committee website, have a good read of it. For any clarification, please feel free to write to us, and we'd be more than happy to assist in the dairy industry having the same result. So, Senator
Just
Canavan.
a couple of quick follow-ups to either witness. Do you physically have to be at the AGM to vote to approve the board, or can you vote by proxy or online, some of the means?
I think Senator, there may be an ability to carry a proxy, but generally it's those people who are actually there who vote, which as it's all the one time in my entire life that of the life of Dairy Australia that I can recall it not being in Melbourne, and it was only down the road from Melbourne. So it's always held in Melbourne, the AGM, and pretty much those who vote are those who are at the meeting.
And typically, Senator Canavan, the people who attend those are those who are paid to come down on behalf of the regional development programs that's underneath Dairy Australia, the chairs and deputies, the farmers. So I'd say that 3/4 of those who are voting and attended are probably aligned with those groups.
Right.
Absolutely.
And just to clarify, it sounds like it's an up and down vote. There's not an ability for someone to nominate themselves from the floor or outside of a select process to sit on the board?
Yeah, that's right, Senator Canavan. There is an ability in there if somebody can, I'm not sure the number of signatures, but raise enough signatures for a specific position to trigger an election that they can stand, and they've got to hold an election for that board position. But I can only recall once that has happened in the life of Dairy Australia, and I think it took quite a bit of effort on that person's behalf. But it's a really difficult process, and virtually.
So in that, you require 100 signatures from members of Dairy Australia to trigger that. But of course, you're not automatically a member of Dairy Australia if you're a dairy farmer. And I would suggest that the majority of the people who are members are those who are aligned to Dairy Australia and the RDP. So I think I'm not sure it's a democratic elected process, and I'm not sure that you'd win that process anyway.
And final question, and I apologise, this has been covered. Of the current board members, what's the mix of those of Dairy Australia? This is obviously of those that are based or from Victoria and Tasmania compared to the fresh milk states.
Well, I don't think there are any members. As I said, I think there's only 3 farmers on that board. Eric, you might correct me if that's right. 3 farmers on that board who are farmers, and I don't think any of those have been from the fresh milk states. And I'm not.
Could you take that on? You could take that on notice if you like. And
There's
come back.
certainly been no Queensland and New South Wales members of the board for the last 10 years. I'm not sure if there was early on, Brian.
The chair at the moment is actually from Victoria, Shepparton and Victoria, Jeff Ogders.
Yeah, Jeff
Odgers. He's the chair of it. So he's actually got about 700 milking cows, but he's also a director of the Bigger Cheese Limited as well. So when we see that Victoria, and as you say, it is a grave concern when you don't have representation from the other states, when you have the main state, Victoria, that is not diminishing in their number of herds like the rest of the country is. And it's clearly by these members on the board, and I've just read through some of them, they don't have a real connection with the grassroots farmer, do they? Dairy farmer, looking at their backgrounds. So the representation, I'd just like to know, as you said, you're scathing of them, is the board under review by any government department or minister, and does that ever happen? Are they answerable to anyone else?
Eric, I think Dairy Australia does have to report to the government as far as that government funding is concerned. And just before you answer that, Eric, I'd just like to throw in one extra. The only member ever on the Dairy Australia board that I know of from Queensland in its existence was Pat Rowley back in 2000 itself. Pat Rowley was a member, but I don't think there's ever been anyone else on that board from Queensland. But Eric, are you aware on that, the other issue?
I thought all the agricultural RDPs sit under the Ag Minister's portfolio. I thought that was the case. So yeah, that's where they report to, and that's why there's been a review of all the agricultural RDPs over the last year or so. And this issue that we're discussing, it's not just unique, certainly to the dairy industry and the meat industry. It's certainly something from my horticultural background as an issue there as well. It's certainly an issue in the sugar industry, which I spent many years working in. I think it's fair to say that it's a lot worse in dairy than it is in some other agricultural industries. Just a couple more questions. I'm aware of the time. I know that Mareeba dairy is really struggling, North Queensland, as Scenic Rim and other areas. We've lost so many dairy farmers. I think we're down to about 300 in Queensland, dairy farmers. Would you consider, or what's your opinion of having a farm gate price for milk? Not sort of regulating, like before, when regulation of the industry was basically you had state that was involved in it plus federal. But if you had a farm gate price set by the ACCC based on region by region, there's 8 regions throughout Australia, that it was based on region by region, the cost of production, so that the dairy farmer is getting at least production cost plus a profit on top of that. And then that is then picked up by the processor and passed on to the consumer. And it's basically supply and demand.
Thanks, Senator. That in itself is certainly not something we're opposed to. But just in the in the investigations that are then done at a national level, and I would say that both ADF and DA are involved in that, in some of the options, there is a lot of extra issues that are thrown up, and certainly at a national level, that hasn't been supported. Yeah, I suppose that it's simply the mechanics of that is the problem at the moment to gaining an industry support of that proposal, but certainly as an outcome, that's certainly not something we would oppose. In a lot of various ways, we're always trying to come around to that same outcome that each region gets a sustainable price for farmers in that region.
One last one. For what you pay in the levy, and what do you believe that should be investigation into the levy that it's paid by the farmers, and where that money is spent and where it goes?
I think transparency is really important in there, where the levy goes, that people understand where it's gone, with the efficiency, the bang for the buck out of that, and whether everyone around the country is getting a fair shake of that levy.
All right, thanks, Chair.
Thanks.
If I could add to that too, sorry. I think many of these companies are pretty good at sort of showing that they've spent the money in decent areas and accountable for it. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to how much of the money spent on priorities and what have been the outcomes against pre-priority areas. And we've got 2 priorities in RD&E in Queensland and New South Wales, which are developing and improving tropical pastures and getting adoption and extension around TMR farming systems. What's been the investment in those 2 areas? Negligible. What has been the outcome in those 2 areas in the last 20 years? Negligible. So you can say you've got 29 wonderful programs or whatever it is, but if they're not the key areas, then you've got a problem. And unfortunately, and this is not just dairy specific, the focus is much more in these companies about maintaining the companies, maintaining the boards, maintaining the staff than actually doing what's required to help farmers. And that's the system we're in. A lot of people don't like what people like Brian and I say about all this, but it's just the facts. It's the blunt facts. The money's not being invested in the right areas because the structures are wrong, and it will never be fixed until the structures are right and the farmers take control of the money which they're being forced to pay.
Pretty straightforward, Mr. Danzy, and I'm not going to push too hard, and I don't want to know which states, but are you having this conversation with other states, firstly? Do they agree or not? Have you got partners here? Because I'll make it easy for you, Mr. Danzy, so that it's not uncomfortable. The question I put to your federal body was the answer coming back was very diplomatic, walking the fine line. It wasn't. I asked them if they were supportive of your comments about Dairy Australia, and it was a bureaucratic answer. Because I'm thinking if you're relying on them to stick it up.
I think it's fair to say that you've heard from Queensland and New South Wales today about our very clear views. We're obviously very much united on the same page, and probably reflects the fact that the work that's being done is not catered at all towards Queensland and New South Wales. And I think in many other states there's probably some division about whether things are working or not working, and they're probably working slightly better because the investment is around temperate systems, which is probably suited to those states a lot better. But is there problems in those states? I can tell you there's problems in every single state in this issue. But you've got some who are obviously very defensive about the status quo in those states, and some who are very anti it. So it becomes division and uncertainty and diplomatic as a result.
And just one thing to clear up so that there's no confusion. And no doubt, RDCs are very good at making it look like they've spent the money effectively. And the ministers are very busy people and understand that. That's why the voice from the ground up has got to be heard at this level here. So coming back to this, to sort of address your concerns, I think, Senator Canavan, and where are these people from, and what experience do they have, and how representative of the levy-paying members? The rotten bit here, correct me if I'm wrong, is there is an oversight board or committee that sits there and says, this person here, we don't see you fit for purpose to run for office to represent farmers, so you're not going to even be able to nominate in the upcoming election. Correct? Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator. Yes, the only alternative that person has is this long, very difficult process of forcing that, which all but one case has not happened. You've got a selection committee that ensures the person suitable to the board and the staff is selected and goes onto the board so that there's nothing to rock the boat.
Imagine if we had that system here. Senator Hanson, you and I wouldn't be here, would we? The government will let us run for our parties?
For sure. So, I just want to know...
Well, you too.
Was the Dairy Australia Board set up after the deregulation of the industry in 2000?
That's correct, Senator. Yes, it was
Right.
set up. It was set up. It was, as I said, it was one of the many things. It was set up out of an amalgamation of the Australian Dairy Corp, which was used to handle exports, basically. That way, along with the DRDC, the research arm, and they were put together heavily by Pat Rowley. As things were obviously changing very quickly and suddenly as deregulation came in, it was one of many rushed, you could virtually say, amalgamations that happened around that time.
Who stipulates the levy? The board?
That the levy Dairy Australia goes out with a levy that then from time to time, and it's just they've changed the years, so I'm not sure how often, but they set the levy, but it goes out. There is an approval process where farmers have to vote on that levy, and so there's an option in there that happens, but it's every, I don't know whether it's 4 or 6 years or where it is now. Actually, at the moment, I think the process is that the farmers may actually need to ask for that vote at the moment. But it's basically it's asked for by Dairy Australia, and it's another one of those things where farmers would have to really band together to say no. But they're only given certain options. It's like an option of 5% more or 10% more or something like that.
What if a farmer cannot afford to pay the levy? Because it's nearly 3 cents a litre. That's a lot of money to a farmer, and it works out about, in some areas, probably in Queensland, $5,000 to $7,000 a farmer a year to pay for this levy. So if you don't pay the levy, what is going to be the repercussions to that farmer?
I don't think the farmer even has the option to not pay the levy, Senator. I think it is taken out by the dairy processor before they ever get their cheque. So I don't think that's an option for virtually any farmer in Australia.
Rightio. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Hanson. Mr Danzy, Senator Canavan.
Just for one question. I just wanted to ask, back to the Dairy Australia issue, obviously they get money from levies. Do you have figures on how much of Dairy Australia's funding comes from Queensland, New South Wales or West, whatever you can break it down for me from those fresh milk states?
Oh, I don't know what the exact budget is now, but it's probably in the order of 53, 54 million, something like that.
Right.
And probably, certainly historically, probably 10% of that's come out of Queensland. So
about 5 million a year, roughly?
No, it's more like 20%, so probably more like 10 million a year.
So 20%, so 10 million a year comes from Queensland.
Yeah.
And do you have figures?
Queensland and New South Wales I'm talking about here.
Oh, so Queensland and New South Wales, sorry.
Yep.
And do you have figures on how much then roughly would get spent back in Queensland and New South Wales a year if you're contributing 10 million? Is it something in that order?
No,
Sounds like nothing
certainly
at the
through the centralised model, a lot stays within Dairy Australia rather than getting out to the regional groups. Yeah,
Right, so not much at all goes back to Queensland and New South Wales?
Maybe a quarter at most.
Right. Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you, Senator Canavan. Mr Danzy, Mr Testman, thank you very much.